Game 9 of the World Chess Championship was another thrilling encounter, and unfortunately it featured a shocking blunder. So let's see what happened here. Jan Nepomniachtchi kicked off with pawn to c4, already a statement of intent that he's going for something different here, trying to shake it up and not going with e4, which he had been playing. We had e6 from Magnus, now g3 from Jan, pawn to d5 and bishop to g2. So we're going down the standard English opening lines, but Magnus now actually goes for an interesting move, pawn to d4. So you can play a lot more solidly here with black, with say knight to f6, and you're just supporting the centre here and not letting this bishop have an increased scope. By going pawn to d4, you open up this bishop, but at the same time you claim space. So it's a slightly more ambitious move, taking the fight back to white. Jan goes knight f3 attacking that pawn, and Magnus goes knight to c6. We had castles now from Jan and bishop to c5 from Magnus. So this is a key battleground now, the d4 square, and that's why Magnus lends support like this. We now had pawn to d3, knight f6 developing, and knight b to d2 now from Jan. So he doesn't mind blocking in this c1 bishop and not getting it outside yet, because he soon wants to play e3, challenging the centre and then recapture with the bishop in 1 and not lose a tempo there. So that's why the knight develops first. And a5 now from Magnus, a very thematic pawn break. So white often wants to push these pawns on the queen side here, gaining some space, and this move starts to clamp down on that, and it also activates this rook here on the a file. We had knight b3 now from Magnus, and the bishop drops back to e7. Note you don't want to go to b6 or you run into c5, and if you go to a7 to try and stay on this diagonal, then you're running into problems with this pawn. You can go bishop d2 attacking the pawn, and if a4 to hit the knight here, well now after knight a5, the queen hits this pawn, and this just isn't a kind of favourable exchange here, because now this centre's coming more under fire once the c6 knight disappears. So Magnus doesn't go in for any of this, he drops back to e7. We now had e3 from Jan, and this is a very logical break, because you need to break down this cramping pawn in the centre. Black doesn't want to go e5 here, because after this exchange, you've opened the e-file now, white's bishop's coming to f4, the knight's coming to e5, the bishop will be open, and even if you kick this knight and it comes back here, it's re-manoeuvring into this beautiful e4 square. So it's just too much of an initiative for white to actually play like this. So after pawn to e3, challenging the centre, that's why Magnus captures. And now again an instructive moment, you might think that you want to take back with the pawn here, taking towards the centre, preparing d4, taking away that square. But the reason this isn't a good move is because of this knight on b3. After the move e5 here, this knight now can't jump into d4. It also can't come to c5 because the bishop controls. And black now has a threat of going a4, pushing the knight away, and white is just getting too passive here. But in the game, Jan recaptures with the bishop, and this is the whole point of taking with the bishop, because now this knight can come to c5 soon. So we had knight to g4 now from Magnus hitting that bishop, and now bishop to c5. That's why this move is suddenly so logical rather than coming to f4, let's say, because now you're going to give the knight a square on c5 after these bishops exchange. So Magnus first castles, he doesn't want to let the knight come in with tempo, and now we had pawn to d4. Jan gets this important break-in in the centre. Magnus now plays a4 to kick that knight, and this forces the bishop exchange, queen recaptures, and the knight comes into c5 here. So white now has a strong centre here, which is cramping black, but if black can undermine this centre or generate counterplay with the a-pawn, then it could be anyone's game. So it's a double-edged position, and that's why Magnus immediately goes a3 here. We note that that pawn was under fire here, attacked twice by queen and knight, so it did have to be dealt with. So a3 seeks to do that. Now, Jan could have played b4 here. This is the main move of all the engines, and Magnus said he would have captured that pawn with the knight, which is the main line to play really. White can then go rook to b1, and the point is you're generating a lot of counterplay against this pawn here. You don't want to jump in and take here, or the knight's actually getting trapped with queen c2. So instead Magnus said he would have played pawn to b6 here, counter-attacking the white knight, And after rook takes, pawn takes, something like rook to b5 here, they're the first to this open file here. We note that this knight also has a dangerous square to come to e5, the bishop will soon be open, so it's still game on here, but it would have been a nice way for white to try for some good advantage. But coming back here, instead of playing b4, Jan actually took on a3. You don't want to go b3 or you're just playing a bit passively really. This knight now can't retreat to this square, and also this is a nice thorn in the position for black. So that's why Jan took. And now Magnus throws in rook to d8, hitting this pawn here. That's why Jan drops back to give that pawn some extra protection and free up his queen for activity. And we now had knight to f6 from Magnus. So he's repositioning this knight. It came into g4 to hit the bishop, which has now disappeared. And so it now needs to find a new job in the game, looking at these more important squares on d5 and e4. So Jan goes rook e1 now, coming onto the line of the queen, keeping an eye on any kind of e5 break from black. We had queen takes on a3 now from Magnus, so he recaptures the pawn, and now queen e2 from Nepo. So he overprotects these two pawns here, and he also connects his rooks with this one move. And this is why I don't love this continuation as much for Jan as the b4 lines. We note here that the knights now had to backpedal to b3, the queen's now activated here, and Magnus's pieces have just generally come into the game a bit more. And now we see some nice prophylactic moves from both players. So Magnus starts with pawn to h6, giving his king some space. We have h4 from Jan doing similar, and now bishop to d7 from Magnus. So he seeks to improve his worst piece here, which is this bishop on c8, and he also connects the rooks in so doing. We have knight to e5 from Jan, opening up the scope of this piece, and the bishop drops back into e8 here. So Jan's not afraid of this capture here. Bishop recaptures, bishop takes, pawn takes, because although the pawns have been doubled and weak, Magnus has now solved his bad light squared bishop issue. He swapped this knight on c6 for the more active one on e5, and he's got nice open lines for his rooks, so he wouldn't be afraid of this. And that's why Jan, instead of going in for this, played queen to e3. So he's protecting this d4 pawn, because we note that it was attacked twice here by these pieces, and then putting the question to Magnus as to how he wants to proceed here. So Magnus plays queen to b4, a logical move which looks to open up this rook and then maybe double on the a file at a later point. And Jan now has to take some action, so he plays rook e to b1, lining up some tactics here with knight to c5 coming, and this forces Magnus's hand to take some action really. He either needs to take on e5, which is what he did in the game, or drop the rook into a3 where it starts to get very tactical. But his time was running a bit lower here, so he went for a more direct approach of knight takes on e5. The pawn recaptures, and it kicks this knight on f6. Now Magnus could have dropped back to d7 and been relatively okay, but he went for a slightly more ambitious move, knight to g4. And what he'd actually overlooked is that white now has a really nice retreating move, queen to e1. So Magnus can't take this pawn here, or the knight is actually getting trapped, because it's got no return square here and it can't jump into e3. So coming back here, Magnus is now forced to trade the queens, the rook recaptures, and he has to go h5. It's the only way to give his knight now an escape square. But Jan now has the opportunity to pick up this pawn on b7. So Magnus now moves his rook, which is attacked, and he eyes this sensitive pawn. And this is where Jan now commits an awful blunder. So he plays pawn to c5 here. And there's a big problem with this move, which we'll see in a moment. But what he should have played here was the immediate f3. Kick this knight away, back to h6, and then recycle the bishop back to say e4. And it's a much more pleasant position for white being a pawn up. Even if this one drops, you can get this a pawn running with deadly effect combined with this bishop on e4. It's not to say this is winning, but white is the one who's pressing. But instead of going in for this, Jan actually played the immediate pawn to c5 to save that pawn, but he'd overlooked the deadly move pawn to c6, and the trap is now shut on this bishop. It's got no squares to move to, and the knight can't come in and defend it. So Jan desperately tried pawn to f3, kicking the knight back, and then rook to e4. But of course Magnus doesn't exchange here. Instead he attacks that bishop, which can't move. We had rook to b4 defending, and now rook to b8. So you can't escape with that bishop anymore. We had pawn to a4 now. The rooks pick up the bishop, rook into b6 here, and now the rook captures, pawn takes and pawn recaptures, and knight c5 now, rescuing that knight which was attacked. Magnus now brings his knight back into the game, hitting this g3 pawn, and here Jan pushes a5, his only possible chance of counterplay, but the game is gone now at this stage. So Magnus drops back to the back rank, keeping an eye on this all-important a8 square, and Jan now goes pawn to a6. And this is where Magnus was really clinical in finishing off the game, so he could have played knight d4 to b5, so that when the pawn reaches a7, that knight is attacking the pawn, and with the rook coming behind it, it can be rounded up. But instead he played the even more precise knight takes on g3, because he's worked out that actually he can get away with this and still control this pawn. If pawn to a7 immediately, now we go rook to a8 coming behind it. And what white wants to do here is go knight to a4 to b6, attacking that rook, but there's just not time because now you take this pawn simply. So that's why instead Jan played here knight to a4 immediately, now setting up this move followed by knight b6. But Magnus had this worked out and he played the all-important move pawn to c5, unleashing this bishop. So now when white goes pawn to a7, which we had in the game, you don't drop the rook back to a8, instead you go rook d8 here, because now if white tries knight b6 here, threatening to queen, now we go bishop to c6, and if the pawn queens, we can simply take that. Let's say knight recaptures. The problem that white has here is this knight's coming to f5 and you're picking up this pawn here. So Magnus would then be 3 pawns up, plus with 2 of them being passed pawns here. So that's why Jan didn't do this. Instead, he took on c5 here, trying this for a move, but after rook to a8, he actually resigned, because the bishop's coming to c6 and this knight will soon make a journey back to round up that pawn, and there's nothing white can do to stop that. So this game was really the nail in the coffin for Jan in this World Championship match. Fair play for him for trying to bring that fight to Magnus, but he just couldn't hold it together in these last few games after that crushing 134 move victory. If you want to see more videos like this, then click here to subscribe, and to see more games featuring Magnus Carlsen, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.